Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the TRN MT4 Pro. So the MT4 Pro differentiates itself from the previous MT4 by having a dual dynamic driver. And literally the most interesting part of this whole set is what you see here. The origin of this set, not how it ended up, but apparently it started out as a collaboration with HBB. So yeah, I think the set itself doesn't really do much for me, but the fact that it started out as a collaboration and the thought of where it could have been, where it could have gone on the signature is actually interesting to me. What they did with it as they ship it out now, not so much. It's kind of okay. And we'll kind of jump into it. And I'll say, yeah, it's an entry-level dual dynamic driver. Priced right. I think it's about $17. They didn't try to overcharge. The signature itself isn't like Zero or Con or Zero Red or Caster Black with the big mid-bass bump. This is more of a traditional signature that you've seen on past sets, and we'll take a look at it in a second. So on the Pro side, I do think that the tuning is more of a clean and clear sound, which is a bit different than the bass boosted sets that you would normally find at this price. This one did kind of tilt it down a little bit, make it a little bit brighter. People who thought cadenza was a little bit too muddy, this is a step in the right direction for you. And the bass is tight, like a TRN dynamic driver. I've said that in the past. TRN does really nice dynamic drivers. But I think the upper range is actually the standout here. I think the extended dynamic driver with a little more technical sound is rare at this price point. And like I said, people tended to think that cadenza wasn't as technical, so maybe a little bit muddy, not as resolving as it could have been. And again, that's just kind of a signature thing versus a quality thing. And here you can kind of see the slight difference between the two, where MT4, just dropped the bass a hair, but enough to tilt this in this direction, so it comes off a little less bassy. And they pushed a lot more energy out here, and this is kind of really hard to hear the mid bass at all, the way they did the connection between the larger dynamic driver and the smaller one. So there's a handoff here, and it just kind of, there isn't a whole lot of mid bass in your ear. And then you end up with a lot of upper range. So the whole thing tended to shift it bright like that, as opposed to where cadenza was, a little bit more bass focused. So that's kind of the main difference. I mean, like I said, there's not a whole lot new here. There's not a whole lot interesting here. It's doing two dynamic drivers. They're done, with two nice dynamic drivers. But again, at this price range, you're not going to see a huge amount of difference in resolution or imaging or any of these other things. You're basically paying for a different flavor of this signature, which is exactly what they delivered here. So on the con side, the bass is a bit isolated. The bass and the kind of the sub bass from the mid bass, there isn't really a nice smooth transition. So everything has a thinner sound than I was really expecting. And this works in the upper more than the lower mids, where it just doesn't have that bass back body. There's no real underpinning to it. It just needs a little bit meat on the bones with some mid bass. It comes across as quite thin. And sound wise, I would call it thin Harman style bass. They really push the emphasis down low into the sub bass. You don't hear much mid bass, and then the sub bass just pops in abruptly. There's not a smooth transition between the two, which is kind of okay at this price range, but not so much above it. The mids, I would call them thin and forward. Again, there's just subtle, just by lowering the bass a little bit, a little less mid bass, you end up with clean and clear. Then they bump this a little bit earlier, and that just brings your vocals a little bit more forward. And this combined with this just ends up being quite a thin sound and not quite out what I was expecting. But then when you look at the graph, it makes a little more sense. These small changes do add up to a bigger overall sound of, a clean, clear, but forward and a little bit thin. So, yeah, and on the mids, thin and forward, the interplay between the low mid bass and the early upper mid is really for medium and lower volume style listening. Too much volume raises the upper mids more than the bass, and it really thins it out. Then you have to lower the volume until you start to hear the bass again. You know, for an entry-level set, it sounds technically good and the levels are reasonable. They didn't do anything that was out of bounds like the TRN has done in the past. This is very recognizable, general appealing levels that they used. The treble, and again, I think it actually sounds more than the price if you're into micro details, extension, and dynamic driver treble. Again, I think the drivers, you know, probably a little bit of the HPB influence, the two drivers that they chose. Very nice. I mean, especially for the price, I think they're executed pretty well as far as resolution and details. And as far as dynamic driver treble, you know, you don't have this weird incoherence or metallic lean to it because of dynamic driver. So treble is pretty good. Stage, and again, it's a little bit inconsistent because of that early upper mid. It flattens the stage and it brings the voices kind of right there in your face. And the upper treble is actually executed quite well with a lot of extension. You end up with a bigger stage. So it's sort of a bigger stage, but in your face and flat at the same time. So we get a lot of width and some height, but there's not really any depth to it. And like everything else about MT4 Pro, it's close. And you can hear how small changes would have made it sound a little bit better. You know, a lot of it comes down to just the small bits that they did here and the lean that they gave it and rising a little bit early, you know, just a bunch of small changes that added up to an overall sound that was close to something quite nice and likable, but came across a bit thin for me and not as likable. So thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.